Now, this is a structure that takes people from one side of the gorge to the other smoothly and simply and in a straightforward way.
A note before we get started. Go to d96toastmasters.ca to download the slideshow presentation and the worksheets referenced in this workshop.
Come with a topic, leave with a speech. I want to turn your topic into a speech. I don't know if anybody knows what this is. It's called the Millau Viaduct. This is the tallest bridge in the world. It goes over the Tarn River Gorge in the south of France. The tallest of the towers is 343 meters high, which is 19 meters higher than the Eiffel Tower. Now, this is a structure that takes people from one side of the gorge to the other smoothly and simply and in a straightforward way. A really good speaker takes the audience on a journey too. And if they have a really nice structure, then they will transport their audience from the opening of the speech to the closing of the speech smoothly. Remember, we talked in the opening, you want to get people's attention, you want to build the connection, and a great speech structure will help the audience move easily along and never lose that connection along the way. Sometimes I think of a speech structure as air. If it's really there, nobody notices it. But as soon as the air is not there, everybody notices it's not there. And so if you build a nice structure, your audience won't necessarily know it's there, but they'll be able to follow your speech easily. So building a speech structure, this module is going to help you describe why it's important to identify the different elements that you're going to include in your speech, choose a logical order to structure those elements into a nice sequence, and select transitions or connectives as you move from one topic to the next. And I hope by the end of this speech, if you brought a topic, then you will have a sensible structure for your speech. All right, there are lots of different elements that you might use in a speech. You could have questions. You can make lists of things, 1, 2, 3. You can use examples. We'll see some examples today. You can express your opinions. You can use quotations. You can present facts and figures. You can stop the action and have the audience take on some activities. You can do some really cool graphical elements. You can share emotions or build emotions. Great if you can use vivid descriptions of things. You can make broad, bold statements and declarations. You can share ideas. You can come up with abstract concepts and explain them to your audience. You can tell stories. In fact, I hope you do. And finally, you can use humor. Now, no one is going to have all of these things in a 5 to 7 minute speech, and this isn't the complete list in the world of all the elements that you might consider using in your speech, but it's a good basic list. The idea is, as you're writing your speech, you may have some ideas. You might have heard a quotation you really like, or you might think of a question that might engage the audience. You might think, if I say it this way, I'm going to get an emotional action. So those are the little elements that you can include. If we talk about this particular speech structure module, we have some introduction and objectives we've covered. I will do a recap and a conclusion. And in the middle, I've got some facts and figures. I told you about a bridge in France. We're going to have some abstract concepts, some examples, some graphics, lists. We'll have 3 sections in the body. We'll have some activities. So they're all going to be here. So I'm going to give you about 45 seconds to a minute to write down just a few words about some key little elements, whether it's a story or an activity or an example or a question that you would like to use in your speech. Great. Now that we talked about speech elements, let's talk about how we sequence them into a structure. And the best speech structure depends entirely on your speech content, your audience. There is no single right structure. You know your content, and if you structure it in such a way that you move from one topic to the next in a logical form, your audience is going to stay engaged through the entire course of your speech. If you lose your audience, if they leave, it's a lot harder to get them back. So best to not let them get off that little road you're taking them on. You may follow a general structure. You don't need to be overly precise. It's not a formula, but there are a few structures that I'm going to talk about that work particularly well in some speeches. 1, chronological order or step-by-step sequence. This follows time. If you were teaching someone how to fix something in their house, it's probably important that they do things in the right order. If you're telling a story that has historical significance, you might do it in chronological order so that people see, okay, this happened, this happened, this happened. If you do that, be careful that you don't make it sound like this happened and then, and then, and then, and then. But it is a really effective way people can track time. They all understand that. Another good structure is spatial. And so this is actual, whereas chronological is time, spatial. If you were talking about the geography of Canada, you might talk about BC, the prairies, Ontario and the Canadian Shield, and then the Maritimes. And people could mentally walk across the map with you. If you're talking about fashion, you might talk about shoes, and then pants, and then shirts and accessories like, for example, a COVID-19 mask, apparently. If people can visualize as you move from one location to the next, they will be able to follow your speech. You might look at perspectives from different groups. Marketers split us all up into Gen X, baby boomers, millennials, Generation Z, all of these different groupings. And if you are presenting, and this one seems to be particularly salient these days, is people need to start understanding other perspectives to get them together. And so if you're speaking about a topic like, how COVID is affecting different people in different countries, or you're talking about something about Black Lives Matter, all of these things, presenting different perspectives in order helps people understand because you can compare and contrast. Next one up is topical sequences. And if you were talking about a project at work, for example, you might start with why it's being proposed. Then you could talk about how it's being proposed. And as you go through this, you're going to explain, first I'm going to talk about why, then how, and what are the next steps. And that will be a nice way for people to follow through. All of these sequences can be sorted in order. So for example, if you were talking about global warming, you might have different spatial sections in your speech. So you might talk about the global impacts. Then you might talk about the impact on Canada. Then you might talk about the impact on the city of Coquitlam or the greater, the GVRD. And if you do it from biggest to smallest, it helps people understand it. It helps put it in perspective. And you can do it either smallest to largest or largest to smallest. But if you've got 3 topics, think hard about what order would work. Last one is there are lots of paired or triplet sequences that you could do. You can talk about the cause and the effect of something. You can talk about advantages and disadvantages, cost and benefit. You can talk about a problem. You can talk about the solution and the next step. So that's a nice little triad. How your speech flows really depends, but these are all different techniques that you can consider. Now, let's look at this module's body. We had a section on speech elements. I had those 15 different speech elements. Then we started talking about speech structures, and that was the chronological, the spatial, all of those different structures that you could consider. And coming up, we're going to talk about connectives. Since this is a module on speech structure, it's highly structured. Within each of these three topic areas, I started with a list. I had a list of speech elements. I had a list of speech structures. In the speech structures section, I talked about an example of this module. And this slide is, if you go across right down the middle, the example of this module, speech structure, that's what this slide is. And after each one, we had an activity for the speech. We're going to do the same thing with connectives. Now, if you're following along and paying attention, you'll know that the next thing that comes up is probably an activity. So the activity, now that you've got a few ideas for what your speech is about, I'm going to give you 1 minute and let you think about what type of speech structure you might want to use. And I'm going to go back to this one and give you some ideas. So 1 minute. So far we've talked about the elements of the speech. We've talked a little bit about the structure, and that helps your audience follow along. A key point in your speech is when you move from one topic to another. That's a great place, if you're not careful, for you to lose your audience. So transitions are how we smooth the flow of ideas from one element of our speech to the next. This helps keep the audience engaged, and it really prevents them from falling off along the way. There are lots of these. One, you could do an internal, what's called an internal preview. And so we did one of these already. It's where at the beginning of your speech, you tell the audience what you're going to do. It's kind of like a table of contents for your speech. Unless you're building a surprise ending, then it probably helps to give the audience some idea, particularly with informative speeches. Doesn't work as well for some of the others, but for informative speeches, where you're presenting a lot of information, it certainly helps. Signposts. This is where you absolutely explicitly say, we're going to talk about the 3 reasons that Macs are better than PCs. First, and then you launch in. Second, you go to your next point. And a third reason Macs are better than PCs is this. This helps your audience understand the structure as you're walking through. And if they get a little bit confused, it helps bring them back. You can have explicit transitions. When we moved into another section here, well, let's just say we're talking about cats. A good example of an explicit transition. We've talked about cats. Now we're going to move on to discuss dogs. If you're using some of the paired triplet sequences we talked about, it's a really great way to go. Now that we understand the problem, let's look at options for a solution. So you're very explicitly telling the person, we've been here, now here's where we're going to go. Next up, we've got the implicit transitions. These are a little bit tougher, but they're even more effective because they don't interrupt the speech with a structure. So if you're telling a story, take some little element of the story and, maybe it's a character or some idea or a person in the story, and use that to transition to the next element of your speech. It can be really smooth. And if people just have one little thing to hang on to as you move from one to the next, then you're not going to lose them. And the last thing, and I can't say this enough, pause. When you finish a section of your speech, unless you've got a really smart transition to move them along, just pause. Give folks a couple of seconds to catch their breath, to catch up with you, and then move on. So, as an example, what transitions did this speech use? We had an internal preview. At the beginning, I gave you a little preview of what we're going to talk about. We had an internal summary where I showed that little diagram of the entire structure. When we moved from the first section where we're talking about speech elements, and in fact, I had a note beside my computer to say, now that we talked about speech elements, let's talk about speech structure. And so that's the internal summary. We've got a couple of external or explicit transitions where I said, we've done this, now we're on to this. And lastly, hopefully, I've had a few pauses. And with that, if you've been paying attention to the structure, you were expecting an activity. And here, what I'd like you to do is go to your worksheet and look at a couple of the main points in your speech and just think about how you're going to transition from one to the next without losing your audience. What have we done? We talked a little bit about speech elements. We talked a little bit about speech structures. We talked a little bit about speech transitions or how you connect those parts. Now what? As Picasso said, "Le rules like prose, you can break them like an artist." If you take anything away from this, take away that it's important to have a structure, but the structure shouldn't drive the speech. The speech should drive the structure. Use a structure that works. And I know that this was a very structured presentation because it was about speech structure, but far more structured than anything I would normally use. See what works and break the structure. It's unlikely that you'll ever have something quite this structured in reality. The French didn't build the Millau Viaduct just because it was a cool thing to do. They did it because they had to get a highway over a gorge. And so the structure was put in place to solve a problem. When you're giving your speech, the thing you're trying to accomplish is to communicate your purpose to your audience. Use a structure that helps, but please, please don't get so focused on the structure that you lose sight of what you're really there for. It's a support. So, building a structure. I hope you can now describe why it's important to identify some of your speech elements, choose a logical order and structure those elements, and select transitions through that structure. And I hope you can develop a sensible structure for your speech, or at least have taken away some ideas of how you would do that.
That's the end of Module 3, Speech Structure. Now go over to Module 4 for Writing Effectively. Go to d96toastmasters.ca to download the resources referenced for this workshop, including the slideshow presentation and the worksheets. A link is provided in the description of the video below. While you're here, like this video and subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment below to tell us what else you'd like to see here.